first habit we're dealing with today is think. We've sort of, when this Harappa framework was set up, this was one of the most critical habits because we've sort of found that the ability to think deliberately and in a very, very high quality way is very important. And it's something that employers are looking for in each and every employee that they bring on board these days. It's not just the fact that you should be able to get the right information. It's also all about what do you do with that information, how do you go forward, what do you use, what do you keep, what do you sort of analyze and sort of take forward with you. It's also about trying to understand other people and understanding what sort of motivates them. How do you think about those decisions? It's about creativity, it's about innovation and bringing in all these ideas when you're problem solving. It's also about understanding that emotional importance is a very, very critical point, or very, very important part of thinking these days. We are bringing with us and to sort of take you through this think habit, we have Joseph Jawahar. He's been with the Harappa sort of idea and the formation of how Harappa came in for a while now. And he's very, very keen and excited about the Harappa habits as well as the think habit. So Joseph, would you like to tell us, a little about, why you think is a very, very important habit in today's day and age?
Today, more than ever in the knowledge economy, we're being asked to apply our mind, to think, to analyze, to problem solve, to be innovative, to create. And all of these are going to involve how well we put the mind to work. And that's the reason this is going to be a crucial skill. In today's economy, the kind of organizations that we have today, this is what they really expect. And this is a foundational skill. Without this, we are not going to be able to do any of the other things. And that's the reason why I believe this is truly a foundational skill, and not just a foundational skill. It's going to be key to how you succeed and navigate in the world that's coming.
So those of you who've met Joseph for the first time, Joseph is a leadership coach and facilitator. He's previously worked with learning and development at various places, including the Bank of America, Standard Chartered, and Satyam Computer Services. We basically are looking to sort of talk about the think habit because it's really your ability to master processes, people, and problems. That's where the think habit in the Harappa sort of universe sits. We're looking to help you, think about things critically, to reason logically, to use creativity while problem solving, and also to stay agile, keep learning, and learn to read other people. These are the 5 sort of skills that the entire think habit sort of teaches, and the courses are based on this. If you see the next slide, you'll find out that almost 76% of LinkedIn LinkedIn report had mentioned that 76% of employers in India today are looking for this particular habit. They want people, or they want to employ people who have this habit as a part of their skills and their framework. This is the 2019 match in which Virat Kohli walked off the field in a match against Pakistan, even though he was not out. We'd like you to take a minute and answer this poll and tell us what you think. What do you think really happened there? Do you think that Kohli walked off because he thought about it? He deliberated. He thought that as a sports person, even though the umpire hasn't said that he's out, it's okay for him to walk out. Or do you feel that he made an instinctive decision, as on the spur of the moment decision?
We just played a little clip of where Kohli walked off the field. Even though he wasn't out, he thought that his bat had nicked the ball, whatever went through his mind. But the replay showed that he actually wasn't out. Now, that was the poll that we did. Remember, Kohli's under pressure. Everyone is watching him. And within a few seconds, he made the decision and walked away. So really what's happening here is it's a very, very quick decision that he has made. He's not really weighing the pros and cons. If there was anything that was going on, the way of very considered thinking, it definitely didn't happen, because he would have been standing there, right? So this is where we need to think about 2 ways in which the brain works. We call that system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking. And we can have the next slide now, Nishant, is this is where Daniel Kahneman is a person who really popularized this way of thinking about system one and system two in how we think. Daniel Kahneman, in case any of you who don't know it, is a Nobel Prize winner. He wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he's done a lot of research and very, very beautiful conclusions. But one of the main things in this book is about how part of the brain is really processing things at very high speed. It's very quick, very often uses shortcuts, and rules of thumb, and makes decisions very fast. It's the one that actually is useful when survival situations are concerned, where we need to make quick decisions, for example, to get out of the way of danger. But that's not the only place where system one thinking plays a role. If you've been trained intensely in a particular field or in a particular career, even in those, when you've done that again and again, you will make quick decisions, right? Because you've done that so many times. So this is called system one thinking, which is why our graphics team has put a lightning flash there as a graphic for that.
True.
Whereas if you compare that on the other side, we have system two thinking represented by a slow burning candle. And that represents situations when we apply our minds, gather data, weigh the pros and cons, see if it is logical, maybe even bring in lots of other prior experiences that we've had, and then make a decision. It's more effortful, more resource intensive in terms of the energy demand on the brain, which is why Daniel Kahneman sometimes calls system one the lazy system, right? Because it just wants to get done with it.
But is it really lazy?
No.
Or is it? No, okay.
It's not. It just, he just gave that as a humorous name. But why he really said it is lazy is because we very often don't want to do system two thinking. It's effortful after all. It'll take time. And because of that, we fall back on system one and do what it tells us very fast. Now, is any of this good or bad? Not really, because system one thinking is needed, as I told you, sometimes in survival situations. It can get you out of harm's way. It can, for example, if there's a car heading down the road towards you and you jump out of the way, system one is working. So very often for all these things that are hardwired, and as I told you, also in situations where, because of your training, you can make a quick decision, which is where Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote this book called Blink, he talks about people like firefighters and others, because of the fact that they've seen so much of these situations, they can make quick decisions because of their training and because of their experience. So we need to make sure that we give system one its due place, but be aware that it can lead us astray. And system one was probably what was at work in Kohli's case when he made that decision. Very quick decision, and he walked off the field, right? He wasn't really doing system two. System one is also where all what we call the cognitive biases sit, which is where I was going to go next.
Okay.
A bias is very often, and that's the slide that we will need next. A bias, very often, the connotation that we have when we think about a bias is a prejudice. Sometimes we'll say, somebody is biased in favor of somebody, right? Or a recruiter is biased in terms of somebody's qualification or where they come from, right? That's typically sometimes what we mean by a bias, but that's not the sense in which we use the word bias here.
Okay.
Yeah. The word bias here means a tendency of the brain to process information in a certain way rather than another. And many of these are hardwired, and many of those are documented through research, and they fall into very, very clear categories, right? And there's nothing right or wrong. Sometimes we need them, but we are interested in the times when it can make us go wrong. Sure.
There's a very interesting question which somebody says, which system thinking is better? Is one better or two? Or does it totally depend on the situation?
Yes. So wherever it's a place where you believe that experience, lots of it, which is why Malcolm Gladwell gives this experience. He gives this figure of 10,000 hours, right? If you've had that much of experience, which is about 10 years of an average working life. So if you've had that much of experience, you can rely on system one. Chances are, because of repeated learning, mistakes that you've made and again correcting it, you've fine-tuned your answer. You can rely on system one thinking there. Similarly, when it's a question of something that evolution has equipped us with, for example, getting out of the way of danger, right? Those are also times when you can rely on it. So these are all places where we can rely on system one's quick judgments.
Can we actually decide for ourselves when we need system one and when we need system two?
Yes, you can. So the thumb rule is very simple. Wherever you have a lot of experience, wherever the outcomes have been fairly consistent and consistently right for you, you can rely on system one. Wherever the situation is very new, wherever the lots of data and application of logic is required, the number of variables are large, you should definitely slow down and use system two. So that's,
Okay, let's move ahead to the biases. We'd already started explaining biases.
yeah.
Can we look at the definition once again and then move into, you, I believe, selected 3 biases you want to talk to us about?
That's right. So first, let's just step back a little. So, go back to the previous slide, Nishant. So the first thing which I want to make sure that all of us get is the bias is sitting in system one, right? A bias is an example of system one thinking. It's quick, it's fast. And the bias is a tendency of the brain to process information in a certain way. And what's the brain mostly doing? It's processing information, evaluating information, it's making judgments, and we take action based on those judgments. So a bias, if it is going to trip us up, is something that we want to know about. And what could be some examples of those, which is where I'm going next. So the first example I'd like to tell you about is something called the confirmation bias, right? So let's go to that slide. Now, a confirmation bias very often by the researchers in the field and by neuroscientists is called the mother of all bias. Okay, yeah. So, the mother of all biases, the reason it's called that is because it's so prevalent, it's so widespread, and it gives off so many offshoots in terms of the number of other sub biases and errors that we make. It's called the mother of all biases. So let's start with that. So what's a confirmation bias? If you, because of certain early experiences, reach a certain conclusion about situations, and then you tend to stick to that original decision or original belief, even though data is coming your way to disconfirm that or to prove it wrong, you ignore all that. So that's an example of confirmation bias. So let me give you an example, right? So let's say that for some reason, maybe anecdotal conversations with people have led you to believe that multinational companies have better human resources policies compared to family owned, smaller, national level companies. Let's say that this is a belief that you hold. Now, what happens is as you go through the job market, as you meet people, as you have conversations, you tend to look for information and data to confirm this original belief that multinational companies have better human resources. And even if you do come across that one or two anecdotes, or if you, let's say you come across some data or information or a report which says that family owned smaller companies also have these kind of people friendly policies, people stay long there, they practically retire from there and things like that, you tend to ignore it. You'll probably say, oh yeah, that's probably because they're all relatives of that company, or maybe that that's just a one-off case, it's an aberration, it's an exception, and we ignore it. And this is true of many other things too. And what's the reason for that? Again, we go back to system one, right? It's easier to stay with an existing belief rather than to challenge yourself by entertaining something contrary. So this is an example of a confirmation bias. This is a belief that you already hold, and you are only looking for data to confirm that belief. You don't want, and in fact, maybe it's also a comfort, right? You just get comfort from this belief. You don't want to test it or challenge it in any way. Maybe for some reason, it helps you to believe that. Maybe,
but
let's
then,
say, yeah.
How do I get rid of this? I mean, if it's not, or how do I learn to identify it and then make sure that it's not sort of, muddling my thinking?
Wonderful. Yeah, exactly. And that should be our core concern, Seema. You're right. And probably there are people who have this question in their mind as they're listening to me. So the way to counter this is make sure that before you reach a conclusion, you deliberately seek as much data as possible and deliberately entertain people and information that comes your way, which tells you the opposite, what we call disconfirming evidence. Then arrive at a decision after you've weighed and given an equal opportunity to both sides. That's the way to make sure that you eliminate this confirmation bias. And as I told you, it's the mother of all biases. Very often it's lurking below the surface. And remember the reason? The reason is, again, what Daniel Kahneman, this is why he called it lazy thinking, right? Because we don't want to disconfirm existing beliefs. So that's an example of the confirmation bias. Yes. So the second bias which I wanted to cover for all of you is the framing bias. Now, what is remember, so there's a previous question also came because of the original connotation of bias. Bias is not prejudice. So just remove that. Bias is a tendency to think in a certain way. Okay. Now, the framing bias has to do with how information is presented. And because it is presented in one way, we tend to make decisions in one way. So let me give you an example. The most common example of this bias is that, there's the old chestnut, right? The glass half empty or the glass half full. Now, this is actually a good example of framing. Let me just tell you an example which is very current in today's world, right? What's happening to us right now. Now, let us say that to break the chain of the COVID infection, the government says you should all isolate yourselves. Do not just be all alone. Isolate yourselves. Now, you look at the way that is framed, right? Now, isolation sounds very negative. It makes us fearful. It can make you alienated. It can sound very scary. So isolation is not a great thing, and might lead to things like depression and things like that. But look at the word that they came up with. What's the word that they came up with? Is social distancing, right? So that's the word they said. And that
No,
sounds.
Joseph, there's a new word.
Is that?
Public distancing.
Oh, is that what it's called now?
That's the new one, because social distancing still has some sort of negative connotations. So
Okay.
the new word that is being recommended, new phrase that is being recommended is public distancing. Because
Beautiful.
then
So you know
so
what
we are framing it in a different way, right?
And thanks for telling me that, because you see, I was still stuck on social distancing. But so let's use these two examples. Imagine the government tells you isolate yourself. On the other hand, they tell you, no, we will now do public distancing. Now that is far more positive. Okay,
Physical, I'm sorry.
yeah,
Physical.
I'm going to.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Don't you think that framing helps? So that's the reason.
Much more.
And so the framing helps because it makes you feel I'm distancing myself from infection. I'm distancing myself from danger. So it's not about isolation where I feel locked up and alone and lonely. So that's an example of how framing can help us to do one set of things rather than another set of things. But remember, the moment I give you this example, many of you will also become alert to the fact that someone may manipulate you into a decision by deliberately framing it in a certain way. And that's what advertisers do. That's what salespeople do. And that's what even the government will do when they want you to behave in a certain way. For example, look at the packaging on the cigarettes, right? Cigarette packaging, right? You have a warning there saying smoking kills. You will not find a cigarette package saying stay away from this package and you will be healthier. It's a very weak frame, and nobody responds to that as much as the so this actually leads me to my next bias, which is called the anchoring bias. Right now, what's the anchoring bias? So let's have the next slide. Now, this anchoring bias is one of those very, very devious, insidious kind of biases, because even without knowing it, somebody can influence you to anchor yourself on a number or a figure or a situation, right? So let me give you an example. Let's take this question I asked you now. Many of you would have guessed probably, I mean, in the range of 12 months, 18 months. And those of you who guessed in those ranges will find that the answer to the next question for most of you, for about 80 to 90% of you, would have been influenced by the answer you gave for how long the vaccine will take to develop. And if you had answered 2 years for that, you would probably find yourself saying the lockdown will be lifted in about 8 months or 10 months or a year, right? So in other words, a number that was stated at the beginning becomes the anchor for a number or an estimate that happens later. And one of the most dramatic examples of how this was done was at the OnePlus 6 launch that happened a few years ago. Yeah. This is a grab from the live streaming that happened when that OnePlus 6 was launched. So the CEO of the company, he gave all the specs. He gave all the technical wizardry that went into creating the OnePlus 6. And there's a lot of buzz. All of you know that nowadays, all these mobile phone companies generate a lot of buzz before the launch. And everybody is trying to figure out what will it cost, what will it have, and all that stuff. And this guy is not talking about the cost. He tells you all the technical stuff. And then he says, okay, so you're all probably wondering, now what's this going to cost me? Okay. Now, people have various figures in their minds, and one of the figures in their mind is also the Samsung, which at the time the flagship was priced at about 75,000, right? Now, he starts a ticker on the screen. It's a giant screen at 99,999. Okay, a big ticker starts. It flashes for a few seconds, 99,999, and at that moment, suddenly you say, "Is that the price?" And then the ticker starts counting downwards, 99,998, 997, 996, and it goes very quickly. Okay, at top speed, and within about 10, 20 seconds, it settles at the final figure, which is the next slide, which is about
You should
30.
take a guess at this. Before we show them, maybe we should see if they know what the actual price could have been. Anyone? No.
Some
Okay,
people,
let's
yeah,
go
some
to
people
the.
probably bought
Oh,
this phone,
nice.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, we got right prices.
Yeah, we
Please
know
show
the
us the
price, right?
next one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's go to the next
next slide.
slide. So the sticker finally settled at around 34,999, right? Now, can you imagine the effect on the people who are watching? They have anchored now on 99,999 because even though that possibly cannot be the price, that's like close to 1 lakh, right? They know that, but still the brain is anchored, and so there's a sigh of relief. Oh, 34,999. Oh, okay, not bad. And remember the
I would
anchor.
have thought I've got a deal. A phone price that starts at 9999 and then goes to 3499. I would have thought I've got the best deal in the world there is to get.
Absolutely.
I,
So, yeah. So he did a very clever thing, and he was actually using this anchoring bias. And salespeople very often do it. If any of you ever gone to buy a vehicle, let's say if you went to buy a car, they will always show you the fully loaded version first, which is really expensive, right? And then because they know that will anchor that in your mind. So let's say the fully loaded version costs 5 lakhs or something. Okay, it's got all kinds of navigation, touch screen, in-car entertainment, and alloy wheels, and I don't know what all, leather upholstery, your personal mazur in the back seat, whatever, right? Everything fully loaded, and then he tells you this is the price, and then you get anchored on that, and then slowly everything else becomes an adjustment downward from there. So the way
is it?
well, the reason that the brain works this way is because we need a starting point, right? We need something with which we can compare. And that's the reason that anybody who can manipulate you can actually manipulate you by using an anchor. So they will put in a figure there that becomes an anchor figure. Very often happens in negotiations, right? So that's the reason why you should fix your own anchor. You don't get influenced by the other guy's anchor. You decide, here is what I can afford. Let's say in a sales situation, right? Here's what, and HR people also use this. For example, a HR guy who's offering you your pay packet when you're getting your job offer will say something like this. They will say the industry average for this position is, or the industry benchmark for this position is, and they'll give you a figure. Now, you notice how that figure will become the anchor later. And so then you'll have to kind of move up or down from there. So that's why you should go in with your anchor, and you should say, here is what I currently make, or here is my aspiration, or here is what I have evaluated my skill set to be worth, and things like that. So otherwise you will find it that you will have to move with this anchor and not the other one, right? So that's the anchoring bias. So somebody's put the emotional intelligence slide up there, Nishant. Okay, so in fact, that's where I was going to go next. All of this would have made you realize, especially when we talked about the framing bias, would have made you realize that the framing is very often in terms of something that causes fear, happiness, hope, envy, whatever, right? To make a decision, especially when people are advertising or trying to persuade you. So that's the reason why part of this think habit will also have to include an amount of emotional intelligence. You cannot be like a robot or like a computer which thinks with a completely rational, objective, algorithmic way of making decisions. As humans, you will be influenced by fear, hope, happiness. All kinds of things will play a role. Whether you like something, whether you dislike something, whether you're disgusted, all these things will play a role in how we make decisions and how we think. And that's the reason that you need to be very, very highly aware of your own emotions and those of others, which is why
Joseph,
Daniel.
can I interrupt for a minute? There's an
Yeah.
interesting question that's come up. So somebody's asking, but if you're emotional, don't they negatively impact our decision making? Isn't this part of the old sort of process of thinking where we thought that emotions should not be used in matters where we are thinking logically and reasonably?
Yeah.
Don't we need our emotions to be able to make decisions as
Yes, we absolutely need. In fact, one of the things that they have actually found through research, and this is again, I was part of a panel discussion that was discussing artificial intelligence and whether artificial intelligence can replace, for example, a psychiatrist, right, who counsels people with psychological problems. And I think the answer that we are now coming up with is that we will need to find a way to put emotion also into the artificial intelligence. Otherwise, it cannot really interact with a human being, right? Now, is it therefore emotional? Sometimes the connotation is that somehow bad, that it is anti-thinking, it's anti-clarity, it's anti-intellect. It's not. Emotion is as much a piece of data that you need. So you need to know how do you feel about something, because that's what is probably making the decision, and that's something that's going to play a role in your decision making. In fact, there is research, and those of you who are interested can look this up, right? There's an example of a woman who had her amygdala removed because of certain brain issues, and they had to remove the portion of the brain which contained the amygdala. And if you've attended the previous Harappa seminar, we spoke about the amygdala. Now, if you remove that, what happens is you essentially throw away the emotional part of your brain. You are no longer afraid, or you don't have any extremes of emotion. Now that becomes a danger. So that particular person, in fact, could not make certain decisions that you and I can make, because she no longer had access to the emotional part of herself. So it's an important thing that, and those of you who are interested can also look up an author called Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscientist and has written a lot of books on the role that emotions play in decision making and the fact that we cannot throw it out of the window. So it's important. So for this particular webinar, I just wanted to mention only two things on emotional intelligence, which is Daniel Goleman's framework contains 5 things. I'm going to talk only about 2. So the first is self-awareness. Are you aware of when an emotion begins inside you? Which is certain sensations, certain feelings, the very stir of the emotion, the movement of the emotion. Can you be aware of that? That right now, what are you feeling? That's the first step. The moment you become aware of that, the next step is, can you regulate that? Now, note this word is regulation. It's not control. We're not suppressing it. Regulation means, can you harness it to the extent needed? In fact, the phrase that I like to use is, do you have the emotion or does the emotion have you? Because if the emotion has you, then you're in the grip of that emotion and you will make a mistake. But if you can control that and say, hey, I use this emotion the way I want. So small example, right? Let's say a child that you're holding by the hand and standing by the side of the road suddenly jumps into the road, you will yell at it. The reason being that you have to use this angry tone in order to get quick compliance. It's a life or death situation, right? Or if you're a sports person, sometimes the anger can drive you to higher performance. Anger that you're not giving your best, or anger that there's an opponent who fouled you, let's say, right, during the match. So we
So
can
that yelling can
harness.
also activate your child's system one thinking, danger, let's do this now, I have to move out, right?
Superbly spotted, Seema. Absolutely. That anger will actually act on the child's system one thinking.
Okay.
And in that moment, the child will respond quickly. Excellent. Yeah,
Okay.
that's it. That's the right explanation for that. Okay, done. So let me move to fallacies next. So we spoke about 3 cognitive biases. Now, what is a fallacy? A fallacy is another class of cognitive distortions. And a fallacy is very simply an error in reasoning. So this is another category of things, and I'm going to give you an example straight away. So let's move to the first of the fallacy. The first fallacy on the next slide that you will see is an example of a fallacy called ad hominem, or the U2 fallacy. So I'm going to give you an example of that, right? So a U2 or a ad hominem fallacy, that's a fallacy that kicks in when you attack the person instead of the argument they're offering you, the logic or the proposition that they're offering you. Let me give you an example that will make it very clear. So let's say you go to see your doctor, and let's say that you have some ankle pain or a knee pain that has begun to surface, and it's beginning to lead to some kind of backache, let's say. And the doctor, after listening to you and doing some examination, he tells you, well, you know what? The fact is that you're gaining too much weight and you have really become overweight now. And that's part of the reason why you're now getting these knee and back problems. So I would recommend that you immediately start trying to lose weight, put in place an exercise program, and please start doing that. And then you, let's say, look at the doctor and you say, well, doctor, you're a fine one to talk. Here you are sitting with your pot belly. You're obviously overweight and you're telling me to lose weight, right? Let's say this is your response to the doctor, right? Now, this is an example of a U2 or an ad hominem fallacy. You're actually attacking the doctor. But
Don't
the
we do this to our bosses all the time?
little more risky area, but let me just cover that too. That's true. I mean, it's the same thing. Okay, let me just complete the doctor example. Let's say the doctor had a partition and you couldn't see him and you could only hear him and you couldn't see he was overweight. Now, would you react the same way? You would not, right? You would only look at the value of that advice for you, the logic in that argument that he's making, that the fact that you are overweight is leading to an extra strain on your knees. Let's come to the boss example. So let's say the boss calls you during your mid-year review and gives you the following feedback. The boss says, hey, you know what, I think you need to reach out more to your teammates, interact with them more, build more bonds, help them more, and only then you'll be considered a team player. And then you turn to the boss and say, well, you're a fine one to talk, you are so introverted, you're such a recluse, and you shouldn't be giving me advice about being a team player. Now that's an example of an ad hominem argument. The boss argument needs to be evaluated just in terms of its logic, its truth, and its applicability to you. Whether the boss himself or herself is of that nature is actually irrelevant. So that's an example of an ad hominem or a U2 fallacy.
How do I deal with this?
Okay.
How do I spot that I'm, sort of doing this, and how do I deal with it?
Yeah. So the first thing you need to do is to completely ignore who is making the argument. In fact, in college courses where they teach you logical reasoning, they actually encourage you to remove the name of the person, and when you're evaluating any argument or proposition, because the knowledge of who said it shouldn't be allowed to cloud your analysis of that, right? So the first step is separate the person. Whoever said it doesn't matter. Evaluate the proposition, evaluate the logic separately. Right? That's the first thing you need to do, right? Ask yourself, is my reaction to that person clouding the logic? That's the first. Now, how do you put it to work for you? Typically, the ad hominem fallacy kicks in at the workplace when we do not like criticism, feedback, or anybody telling us anything, right? So we tend to attack the person. But that's the easier thing to do. Then the other person will retreat, right? Because they will say, okay, I give up, okay, yeah, true, and they'll go away. So we need to make sure that we're not attacking the person, but evaluate the argument purely on its logic and its own merit. So there's a last one I wanted to cover for you, a slippery slope. And I selected it also because of a little bit of fun that I thought I'll have with all of you in this one, right? Because the slippery slope fallacy is very funny, really, right? The fallacy actually has to do with the fact that the brain always looks at causes and effects. And very often you have a cause and then you have an effect. And the effect then leads to a further cause and then a further effect. So that's a cascade or a chain reaction. Now, because we know that sometimes this happens in the world, the brain stores this as a model, but sometimes the fallacy results when we overuse it. Let me give you an example. So let's say somebody who's talking to you about this whole COVID crisis says something like this. They say, you know what, economic activity is down, which means that many of companies will lay off people. Those laid off people will be desperate for jobs. And because they have no other way, they will now become lawless. That will spread to lead to rioting. Socially, there'll be a lot of unrest. We'll become a mess as a country, and finally civilization as a whole will collapse. So you notice where it starts, right? It starts from just the economic impact of the COVID virus and leads on. And before you know it, the slippery slope, you're kind of rolling down the slippery slope towards the catastrophe, and the catastrophe is predicted, right? So that's an example of a slippery slope fallacy in today's situation. And I just end with a lighthearted example of this. Sometimes, when you're young, and let's say you're in your early 20s, you've got your first job and you're just wondering about now how my job will be, and you're planning out your future, and your parents get after you and they tell you something like this, maybe we should start looking out to get you married off or something like that, right? Let's start looking. And then you say, no, you know what, I'm not ready. I may postpone it till I'm 30. I may only want to think about it when I'm 35. And then you say, no, you can't do that. If you do that, you'll be lonely. Then you'll become too old. Nobody will want to marry you. You'll become an old maid. You'll become an old guy. You'll die alone and childless and surrounded by nobody. And then you see how this is a slippery slope fallacy, right? Where did it start? Started with just one small decision, and it was about how this leads to further and further things to a catastrophe, which need not necessarily be true. So we only have to stop that chain at the place up to which we have logic and data, and there is no justification for assuming that it will cascade or snowball in this fashion. So that's called the slippery slope fallacy.
So finally, I think at the end of this, we wanted to just say, if you want to develop yourself as a critical thinker or as someone with a reasoning ability that's logical, what is it? What is the one or two things that you must pay attention to, Joseph? What do you think?
If you want to develop as a critical thinker, or if you want to bring more logic into your life, then I think one of the practices that you will have to begin to do on a regular basis is, whenever you read a paragraph, or whenever you're listening to people, get into the habit of automatically asking yourself, is there anything that is biasing me right now? Is there any way in which this person is framing what they're saying? So it'll take a while, right? So some of our reading that we have given you towards the end of this presentation will help you make a beginning to develop some kind of a cheat sheet. So I have my own favorites among that list also, even
Can
though
we
I've
look
read all
at
of.
Joseph's list of books, please? Can we look at the books, please? Thank you.
Yeah, these are my recommendations just for this webinar. But you probably won't read it. But the one that I would like you to start off with is number 3, The Art of Thinking Clearly, Rolf Dobelli. Those of you who want to get a quick start on this, right? That book is not a cover to cover book. He has actually collected researched cognitive biases, about 99 of them. He has collected them, and there are 99 chapters. Each chapter is just a few pages long and deals with only one cognitive bias. So you can read any part of it, right, that you like. And he's also told you how to counter those biases. So if you ask me for my opinion, if you want to start with that book, and then continue on to Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence if you have the energy. And if you manage to read both these books, buy the remaining 2.